I'm excited to introduce our next speaker. So Dr. Timothy Gross is an associate professor of China Studies at Rose-Hulman Institute of Technology. His research on expressions of Uyghur ethno-national identities and public performances of Islamic piety has been published in the China Journal, Journal of Contemporary China, Ethnic and Racial Studies, China File, Dissent and Foreign Policy. Timothy's commentary on ethnic policy in Xinjiang has appeared in Al Jazeera, The Atlantic, CNN, The Diplomat, Economist, The Guardian, and Vox, among others. You can see he's extensively published. His book on boarding schools for Uyghur students, Negotiating Inseparability, was published by Hong Kong University Press in 2019 and awarded the 2020 Central Eurasian Studies Society Book Prize in Social Sciences. Welcome, Dr. Gross.
Well, thank you very much for the introduction and all the work that you've put forth in organizing what's been a really great workshop. I've actually been on the entire time and have learned so much. And I can't believe we're already here. I was looking back at my inbox and realized that the first email you sent me was in October. So this is great that it's been such a success. And as I start my PowerPoint, I also want to thank everyone in attendance today, the educators. My wife's a classroom teacher, and I know the efforts and the tireless work that you put forth on a daily basis. And sometimes this work is really thankless too. And now you're, taking time out of your weekends and taking time out of your family to join us. So I do want to thank everyone in attendance. So today I'm going to talk about the crisis going on in the Uyghur homeland, and then maybe plot out some ways that we can teach this to students at various levels, but maybe looking more inward at some examples closer to home. And with these talks, I'm always not quite sure where or when to start, because what's going on in Xinjiang, or the Uyghur homeland right now, is not something that started in 2016, nor was it something that started in 2009 with a large-scale protests, nor did it even really start in 1949 when the Chinese Communist Party was victorious over the nationalists and established the People's Republic of China. We have to go way back, but of course, time is also a constraint. So I'd like to begin by looking at where the Uyghur homeland is, especially in relation to the rest of the Central Eurasian continent and mainland China. And as we notice, and it's not plotted on this map, but really the cultural and religious center of the Uyghur homeland is a city in Kashgar, which is in southwest, now the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. And it's closer to Baghdad than it is Beijing, of course, the current capital of China, and various imperial capitals, and really kind of the heart and soul of quote unquote Chinese culture. So it's not a surprise that over time, the identities and the cultures that crystallize in this region look, sound very, very different from the types of cultures that were forming in now what is known colloquially as mainland China. And this was fine, even with various degrees of presence by Chinese imperial states. And I use the word Chinese, lightly and with flexibility, keeping in mind that the last imperial dynasty, the Qing, was ruled by Manchus, nomadic people from the north east. Nevertheless, the relationship between the Uyghur homeland and China at best was loose, if not non-existent, and that was fine until the establishment of the People's Republic of China in 1949, and their visions of actually constructing a coherent nation state. And as we see, by looking at the top individual, the top politician in the region, with the exception of 1972 to 1978, that the party secretary, who is the most important official in the region, has been Han Chinese. So despite having officially an autonomous status, and this autonomous status is meant to give Uyghurs more freedoms and flexibilities in the ways they quote unquote use and develop their language and culture, that the one overseeing all the policies has been, again, with just one small exception, have been Han Chinese. And this is coupled with mass migration to the region. So as we notice at the very beginning of the People's Republic of China in 1949, the area had very, very few Han people, Han being the majority population in China, over 1 billion. Though keep in mind, we can't treat them as a monolith, right? There's a lot of diversity within the Han people. Nevertheless, they're recognized by the state as belonging to this Han group, and there were very few of them in 1949, but these numbers increase significantly, especially during the reform era. So after Mao's death in 1976, China went through a period of economic and political reforms that were ushered in by Deng Xiaoping. And as you see, during that era and continuing into the day, we have a large increase of the number of Han people. So all of these conditions are kind of coming together and producing a perfect storm. And this doesn't touch the surface yet, and this happens before, we'll get onto it later in the talk, of religious oppression. We won't have time to talk about language policy in schools, etc. But again, we have this perfect storm forming. And then there were widespread demonstrations in the city of Urumqi on July 5th, 2009. And this really sent a warning signal to Beijing that it hadn't garnered the loyalty of Uyghur people. Now, somewhat ironically, the cause of the protests was an incident that occurred thousands of miles away in Shaoguan in Guangdong province, an incident involving Uyghur factory workers who were killed by Han individuals over rumors that the Uyghur workers had harassed some local women, which those allegations proved to be false. Nevertheless, that again is considered by many commentators as really the turning point in relations between Uyghurs and the Chinese Communist Party government, and maybe even more broadly between Uyghurs and Han people. And then following a couple years of more or less stability, but a kind of an awkward forced stability between 2013 and 2014, there were episodes of sporadic violence, many of which, or many events or episodes, which would fit most definitions of terrorism. And we had, two narratives begin to emerge to explain the violence, and it's I'm trying to capture it on the left and right. So, coming from the Chinese Communist Party, they've insisted that the violence has been connected, it's well orchestrated, and for the most part is being planned from the outside through a kind of a shadowy network of individuals who have formed what's known as the East Turkestan Islamic Movement, who gets funding from various different entities, but was often described by the Chinese Communist Party as a terrorist organization, the World Uyghur Congress, and more specifically still used to be one of the richest women in China, who happened to be Uyghur, Rabia Qadir. In any case, they try to trace all episodes of violence to essentially one of these three sources, and to fit in the broader narrative of global terrorism. Now, what most independent researchers have shown, and I think have shown with much more convincingly, is that the violence, although certainly should be condemned, is not part of larger transnational Islamist groups or terrorist groups, but rather these are very local reactions to essentially colonization. And for those who have time and who are interested, I would direct you to my colleague and friend's books, China's War on Uyghurs, written by Sean Roberts. And I think he summarizes the increase in violence quite well. Essentially, he explains it as the state increasingly profiled Uyghurs as a threat, kept them under constant surveillance and marginalized them in their own homeland. It was almost inevitable that the Uyghur response to these pressures would be violent rage. And then it produces this vicious cycle. And the PRC then pointed to this evidence of this rage to justify that it had been correct from the very beginning regarding the terrorist threat posed by the population. So again, we see this vicious cycle occurring until it was put to an abrupt and violent end in itself. So we had violence met with more violence, this in the form of state violence, with the construction of detention centers, known more specifically as re-education or transformation through education centers. And these began to pop up throughout the region. My work in the last few years has been to document and archive instances of these mass detentions as they appear in Chinese social media, more specifically accounts written or accounts kept and maintained by lower level officials, especially those who have been assigned to live in Uyghur villages. And so here are some of the images that weren't meant for public consumption, certainly weren't meant for a non-Chinese audience and maybe even a non-Chinese audience that wasn't part of these policies. But here we see images inside these so-called re-education centers. And here are a few more images of what takes place in them. And looking at different official reports, we begin to have an idea of a curriculum, quote unquote, that the detainees have to go through. And basically, it's a steady course of patriotism, of Chinese language classes, on religious policy, birth control policy, et cetera, which seems to be a bit concerning and questionable, considering that many of the individuals who were caught up in these mass detentions, and many still who have been now formally sentenced in trumped up charges, were already very educated, intellectual elite, presidents of universities, actors, musicians, poets. And so one of the first explanations by the Chinese Communist Party, who, by the way, denied the existence of these concentration centers for over a year, was that they were providing necessary education for otherwise uneducated and impoverished populations. So again, keeping in mind that there are I think documented over 300 intellectuals who have disappeared and whose whereabouts are unknown. And here another image of what's going on in these re-education centers. And now that we have some survivors of the re-education centers out and they have shared their experiences, and many recall again the insistence on speaking Chinese and the punishments they had to endure if they were overheard speaking their native languages. And the mass detentions of Uyghur and Kazakh adults, and we don't, have a number. We don't have an exact number. Looking at some of the local, think at village level numbers that we were able to obtain. In some places, as much as or as many as 16% of the total population has been detained, but we don't. At least I don't have enough data points that I'm confident of making a broad estimate. Nevertheless, we do know that the mass internment of Uyghur adults has led to the separation of children from their parents. Here we have images from the, essentially the same set of sources. On the top left, this was a school that was specifically constructed to house young children whose both parents were detained. The picture on the far right, where there are individual students behind desks and who have blurred their faces. Of the 5,500 students at this school, over 1,700 are children of parents who have been detained. So again, we have indisputable evidence that shows the separation of children from their parents. But the crisis doesn't end with the mass detentions. We also have a substantial body of sources that show new directions and new violent directions in the enforcement of birth control policies in the area, especially amongst ethnic minority women like Uyghurs and Kazakhs. And what has emerged as now the preferred method of birth control by the Chinese Communist Party has been quote unquote long-term measures, especially the insertion of IUDs of women of childbearing age. And so here we have an image of one of the clinics where either these women are having IUDs inserted, or they're having their IUDs checked, or they're having pregnancy checks. And of course, the availability of widespread birth control is something that is important for any society, and having access to birth control is important to Uyghurs and Kazakhs all the same. What is alarming about the insistence of these new birth control methods is one, the time that in essentially a 2-year time, the preferred method of birth control in the region became IUDs, and this wasn't going on in the rest of China. And the other alarming part of it is the frequency in which the IUDs are checked. And I claim no medical expertise at all, but I'm concerned at the fact that these birth control planning committees require that the IUDs are checked quarterly, so every 4 months. And many of these teams have celebrated the success of these new birth control policies, and they celebrate the absence of quote unquote illegal births. The image that just popped up on this screen has one team saying that the implementation of birth control methods and education has resulted that in this particular village, we didn't have to perform even a single abortion. So of course, the implication being that if there was a child if there was a woman who became pregnant and this was a quote unquote illegal birth, then the birth would be terminated. And the extent and really the extensiveness of the oppression in the region, like I said, this could be an entire day's workshop in itself. So I'm just really trying to give you snapshots. So in addition to the mass internments and the invasive and violent birth control policies, we are also seeing restrictions on religious practice that haven't been this tight since the Cultural Revolution, which Mao instigated in 1966, and it lasted till his death in 1976. Bear in mind that officially the Chinese Communist Party and its constitution guarantees religious freedom, but this religious freedom is specifically within the realm of religious belief. As you'll see in the Constitution article that I've extracted for you, there's no mention of protections of religious activities, only quote unquote normal religious activities, which we'll see quite clearly is often arbitrarily defined and imposed. Chinese social media or Chinese official media who are trying to deflect and protest the claims of religious oppression and restrictions in the region will often point to the fact that Xinjiang has 24,000 mosques. Well, many have been destroyed since these numbers have been calculated. But what they don't want to tell you is the restrictions placed and who can actually enter a mosque. And so this is a photo that I took in the region a few years ago. These posters were hung outside every religious building in the region, especially mosques. And they list what the illegal religious activities are. And as we'll see in the ones that I've highlighted in red, that many of these quote unquote illegal religious activities could be essentially imposed to restrict just about anything. So for example, using religion to organize activities that can hinder social order. So we don't know exactly how social order is defined, and we don't know how religious activities could perhaps hinder those things. And so we have these arbitrary rules and definitions of what is illegal and what's normal. And we also have the construction of a very elaborate high-tech surveillance system that records essentially who goes in and who goes out of the mosques. There are cameras inside that record all of the sermons that are being delivered inside mosques on the Jummah, and also again who are taking part in the prayers. But I think more in terms of the more or the stricter restrictions are we can see through the limitations on who can actually enter the mosque. Minors, college students, and anyone employed by the government, and now their immediate family are forbidden from praying inside mosques, and many from inside their homes. We saw the surveillance cameras in the previous slide outside the mosques. Many of the mosques that are in urban centers are connected and monitored through these centralized surveillance centers. So here we have individuals looking at all the mosques activity at once. For those rural areas, work teams are staffed outside of mosques, and they keep track of who enters the mosques and when and how many times a week they've entered the mosques, et cetera. And as I mentioned, mosques are being destroyed and damaged in large numbers. And this is just one very, very specific example where we have a government cadre, a government official noting that the number of mosques in this particular area, in his particular village, was quote unquote adjusted. What he means is destroyed. They're from 10 to 4. We don't have time to look at all of the examples of religious restrictions, but I want to do one more, and that's the restrictions on fasting during Ramadan. So we already know similar or the same as mosque attendance, that if you are a minor, a college student, you cannot you cannot enter the mosque, you cannot fast. The same in an extension for fasting during Ramadan. Guardians in several elementary schools also pledge not to fast during Ramadan, and they also take an oath that they'll provide their children 3 meals a day and vow to keep their children away from any sort of religious activity. Retired teachers in some areas now have to take an oath that they will not fast during Ramadan. If they do, they'll be accused of being a two-faced person. A two-faced person is an individual who was or is employed by the government, but still has sympathies towards religious expressions of their ethnic group, and is also a reason to be detained. other places organize meals during Ramadan and during the day as ways to prevent individuals from fasting. Of course, these aren't the types of invitations that you can refuse, especially if you know that mass detentions were going on. And then here we see just how extensive these restrictions are, where family members, including children, parents, in-laws, grandparents, spouses, grandparents, et cetera, so essentially, if you have any connection to the government at all, your extended family is forbidden from taking part in any sort of religious activities. And bear in mind that the state, the Chinese Communist Party, is the largest employer of Uyghurs in Xinjiang, not in small part to the fact that there are no discrimination laws in the private sector. So it's very common for Uyghurs to be unable to find work in the private sphere. So another layer of the violence takes the form of maybe the most invasive policy, and that's government homestays. And so here are some images of what these government homestays look like. And in a nutshell, beginning in 2016, well, it was accelerated in 2016, but beginning in really 2014 and 15, the government conceived of a program called Fanghuiju. There's no real good way of translating it, but essentially it sent down over 1 million officials, many of them young, to live, work, eat, sleep with Uyghur families. Between 2016 and 2018, these workers made 24 million total house visits, so not individual houses, but oftentimes families have to be called upon several times a week, depending on what their status is. They conducted over 33 million interviews, and what we've learned from a lot of the blogs from these cadres is that these interviews are more like interrogations. And they organize over 8 million ethnic, quote unquote, ethnic unity activities. So this is a handbook used by these sent down worker teams. Questions include how many people in your family, do your children attend school, where are your parents, especially if they're migrant workers, how much money do you make? It goes on and on. Can you speak Chinese? Do you pray? Et cetera, et cetera. So these are ways of obtaining intelligence. And when they're not engaged in these type of interviews, oftentimes these work teams organize study sessions in the home where the family reading alongside mostly Han officials have to study Chinese and policy. So it's almost as if it's a house arrest. So even if you were able to avoid detention, again, there are very, very immobilizing restrictions for Uyghurs, and they become almost essentially prisoners in their own home. And to wrap things up, I know I'm running out of time, and I want there'd be ample time for questions. That's usually one of the best conversations and most helpful, I think, for attendees, especially in these virtual deliveries. Is, well, how do we make sense of it? And I think that this is an opportunity, especially as educators, for us to look inward. To look at the United States' own history of nation building and the consequences of that nation building, especially looking at the erasure of Native American culture. And certainly, when we look at the remarks of Richard Pratt, who was the engineer of indigenous boarding schools in the area, his vision was that they were, quote unquote, civilizing, right? And so when we start to get into discussions and debates and very, very contentious debates about what do we call the type of violence that's occurring in Xinjiang right now, we have to keep in mind that the rhetoric of the Chinese Communist Party is eerily similar to the rhetoric of the US federal government, and more specifically, Richard Pratt. And that is that these are supposed to be about poverty alleviation, about civic participation, about quote unquote civilizing. And so Richard Pratt thought he was a progressive of the time because he was against, the physical destruction of Native people. Rather, he wanted to see the Native person, the indigenous populations as part of America, but as a part of America that the indigenous populations had no say in defining. And so that's where he had his very dreadful quote that all the Indian there is in the race should be dead, kill the Indian in him, and save the man. In taking, and I really like the first discussion and the the introduction to the workshop and the difficulties and the problems with drawing parallels between historic events. But still, I think there's something to keep in mind as we think through the crisis going on in Xinjiang, especially when we try to decide what we should call it. And what I've learned, speaking with lawyers and human rights activists and other academics, I don't have the expertise, nor do I have the qualifications or the credentials to make any sort of legal opinion about what's going on. So we look at definitions of genocide. It appears that there are some examples of state violence that fit these definitions, right? So, calculated, so the bringing conditions of life calculated to bring about physical destruction and part of a whole. Again, the language is ambiguous. Imposing measures intended to prevent birth within the group, well, surely there are some of those measures. Forcibly transferring children of the group to another group, or with the mass detentions, this is almost by default what's going on. Others are in favor and prefer describing the events as crimes against humanity. And we see, again, there's checking the boxes, there's forcible transfer of populations. We need even talk about labor transfer in this talk. Imprisonment, surely we have indisputable evidence of mass internments. Some of whom have testified publicly that there's rape that occurs within these facilities. Certainly, Uyghurs and Kazakhs being persecuted on the basis of their identity and forced disappearances. I still have friends and colleagues whose whereabouts I don't know. So again, we can use these as perhaps useful tools to help determine what's going on here. But I think by doing that, we almost deflect attention on the violence itself and invite unnecessary, and I think just unnecessary and then really non-productive, unproductive ways of talking about the violence, because it invites it invites argument, and rather I think we could, especially when we reach out to students at all grade levels, maybe that this example provides us with an informative case study on the dangers of nation building and state building. And we can use the Uyghur example and Native American examples to show, just how damaging and destructive nation building can be. And questions that we should ask in any case, whether we're talking about Uyghurs or Native Americans, is, who's envisioning this nation? In these visions of nations, whose ideas and voices have been marginalized, ignored, and suppressed? Who's defining the essential elements of the nation? What cultural expressions have been attached to the nation? And then who must sacrifice most for membership in this nation? And what must be abandoned, suppressed for this participation? I think that, maybe using this framework, the attention could be placed on the violence that has occurred in the past, the violence that's continuing in the Uyghur homeland, and it can do so in a way that, again, the attention is on the victims and not on politicized terms. So I'd like to stop there and then use the rest of what time I've been given for Q&A.